now turn it over to Richie Earl, Russell Walters, Grant Ward, and Dave Warden. And I'm going to prompt you with one preliminary question, and then after that, I'll just let you ramble, okay? Before I do that, I'm going to turn the mic over to you after I get my cheat sheet. Simple question. What got you in this crazy business in the first place?
You want me to?
You can pass it any way you want to.
In my own case, I grew up in Westport Harbor and literally was on the river as a little kid, right from the start. I just loved being on the water, and eventually I reached the conclusion that I had to do something or a living on the water.
In my case, we summered in Westport from the time I could remember. I went off to college, realized that wasn't it for me. Came back here, and like everybody else at that time, I pounded nails, this and that, and then this youngster at the very end here was looking for some help on a boat that they had just bought, and that's how it started for me.
I grew up between Fall River and Westport. I used to sit on the beach and watch the boats go to sea, and I'd say, boy, that's where I want to be. And I was very fortunate. I got to go fishing with some really great guys and learned a lot, and continued on to work in the mechanical part of the fishing industry, and it was great, just great.
I just fell into it. Now, I grew up at Westport Point. I was a wharf rat, a river rat, whatever you want to call it. And I used to go to my father's beach club and work over there when I was about 12 years old. And I saw the boats all going out, come back, the day boats, they come back in the afternoon. Some of them had swordfish, some had lobsters. And I think that's what got people. Anyway, glad you're all here. Like Al said, we'll go for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes. And I'll give it back to Al here if he wants.
Well,
You got any more questions?
I'm looking for the other mic, but that's okay. I'll have to take
All right,
that
keep looking. There's a couple of people. There's a couple of people here I'd like to acknowledge that have come today. One is John Osborne sitting over here with his cane. Stick your cane up here, John. John came to Westport with Bill Whipple in about 1961 or so. 62. What?
Changed everything.
Yeah, Bill Whipple had a big fingerprint on the lobster business in Westport. So we'll probably talk about that today. And the other person I'd like to acknowledge is Bob Hayes. Bob's just getting out of rehab after a bad auto accident. And glad he's here. But anyway, this is supposed to be a PowerPoint presentation. And I guess maybe all of you, I don't know.
Point, Richie.
It's supposed to be a PowerPoint presentation, but unfortunately Jennifer O'Neill, the director of the Historical Society, she came back from Australia with COVID. So we couldn't load it. So it's a complete different deal talking to a picture and just winging it. I think we're all winging it. Are we winging it today?
No,
Russell's prepared. Anyway, but lobstering, I got to check my clock and make sure I don't go over 10 minutes.
I'll remind you.
No, you've got 40, remember?
40, okay. So anyway, lobstering started out way back, and I'd like to acknowledge Russell Hart. Russell did he's 96 years old, he lives up on Sanford Road. He's been a selectman, assessor, highway surveyor, I'm missing some now, but, and a fisherman, lobsterman, and his family was in lobstering, and he did a report about 2006 on fishing boats in Westport, and the fishing thing, and I think the historicals has that in their
Yes, it is.
archives or whatever.
Right.
So anyway, it's really detailed, and it goes way back, and it talks about, you know, people lobstering out of skiffs off the beach, sailboats. Then when the engines came out in World War I, after World War I, little 1 and 2 cylinder engines were available, so people started to venture out farther, and eventually they got, by 1930-ish, they probably got 10 miles out off the shore, Brown's Ledge, or out past what we used to call the Buzzards Bay Tower. And then it's evolved, and of course lobster pots were hauled by hand. They were wooden pots. Trying to keep them alive was a big problem. And they had to keep them in crates in the water. There was no refrigeration way back then. And then things evolved up to after World War II. Bigger engines came in, Gray Marine and 671 diesels, things like that. So in the 40s, the boats would get down a little bit further and eventually got to what we call Cox's Sledge in South by Shoals, which is about 20, 25 miles offshore. So, but there was probably a handful at Westport Point of lobster boats through that period. There was some that came out of the West River, Joe Whittle and Pete Manchester later on, and Don Fields, Joe Fields, he died at sea, I think. And his family got into it, so there were people up in the West River. But the lobsters, when they brought them in, they sold them to the restaurants. I think it was Joe Whittle's wife had a restaurant on River Road, 96 River Road area. And so lobsters, I guess when they got them, they had to eat them pretty quick because they couldn't keep them alive. There was no refrigeration. And of course, for the boats, they couldn't make long trips. They didn't have the equipment until after the Second World War. And then about the 50s, the boats started getting bigger, and then there was an influx of what we call Novi boats, which were about 38 feet long, built up in Canada, and they were fairly inexpensive, but the government wouldn't allow bigger than 38. They wanted to protect the shipbuilders up in Maine, so they limited the size. And then, so they were at the point, but when you look at it, at the point, the west dock wasn't there. It's there now. There's 3 docks. There's Lee's Wharf for the oyster farm now. There's the middle dock, the town dock, mud dock area. And then there's the old rock pile, which was just a breakwater until about 1968. And Russ Hart, I'm not positive where he was at that particular time in town government, but I think he might have been a selectman.
I think it was a selectman.
At that time, Russell realized that there was a big demand for more space for lobster boats. In the 60s, it was like the gold rush. That's when Whipple was on the scene, and everybody, he opened a lot of people's eyes when it came to lobstering. And we can get into that later on. But Russell got that dock put together as a selectman. He got Fred Camber, who was the highway surveyor, to make the highway department available to build the thing. They got the steel from the Slade's Ferry Bridge to build it. My brother Tom did some of the cement work and stuff on it. My brother Bill ran a dredge boat. I think Trips owned it at the time. They dredged a new channel. But they built that west dock, and that allowed dockage for probably another 10 or 12 boats. The one thing I think that Mr. Whipple ran into was that Westport didn't have an infrastructure to support a big fleet, big sized boats, and what you needed. But Russ Hart, hats off to him. And then in about 1961, whatever, John Osborne showed up with Bill Whipple on a boat called the Horizon with a bunch of big lobster pots on the back, which they called big lobster traps. It went from pots to traps, the terminology. But John's here, and he was very innovative and determined and inquisitive, and he's a pretty good sized man. And he ended up settling here in Westport, started the Prelude Corporation, and they had 4 boats, I don't know, Bob, what were they, 80 to 100 feet?
Yep, 3 of them were 88 to 90 feet or so, and one was 125.
Right, so those are big boats for him.
No.
But this was in the 60s now. And dredging was a problem then, and you couldn't get dredging done. So the corporation ended up moving out of Westport. But anyway, there was like a gold rush of lobsters in the 60s, and that's when we got started. And these guys here, Grant and Russell and David, I think that's kind of when it started to take off pretty good, 60s, early 70s.
So Russell, what was your, I'm just hanging out in the corner here, yeah. Grab the mic and tell your
My little story.
Your story, and then pass it along.
Forgive me for the notes. Richie said to keep it short, so I kept it within 1 pad. My brain doesn't work quite like it used to, so. When I was a little kid, I used to go to Owl's Head, Maine with my uncle. And he had a buddy that was a lobster fisherman, so he used to take me with him. And they hauled the lobster traps with a winch head. There's a winch head right here. And the winch head was mounted between the steering wheel and the rail of the boat, stuck out perpendicular, had a shaft that went through the bulkhead, and it turned continually. It was just belt driven from the main engine. So we had this thing spinning all the time. So they get up to a trap, get the buoy, throw it over the davit, take a couple turns on the winch head, and stop pulling the line, and the friction would haul the trap. Well, they had a couple of things with this that if you got one line over the other, that was called a riding turn, and there was no getting it off. So you either shut the engine off, or the trap went through the davit. The other beauty of it is if you got tangled up in it, you could lose an arm or something, and a lot of the guys had their sleeves cut off just below the elbow so they wouldn't get tangled up in this thing. But it was much better than hauling by hand. They could haul a lot of traps. I think John could tell you exactly how we used to do it years ago, but that was the first thing as far as mechanical stuff, hauling traps. A little later on the line came a company in Maine called Hydroslave, and they built what I remember as the first lobster trap hauler. And if you picture 2 dinner plates back to back, that was what the shivs were. And the line would go between the shivs. Now here's a big lobster trap hauler right there. You can see the shivs on it. And the beauty of this was it was hydraulic. Hydraulic changed everything. So you had a pump mounted on the engine, belt driven. You had a hydraulic valve. You could turn the thing on, you could turn it off, you could back it up. Much safer. You take the line, throw it over the davit, go around the idler, put it between the shivs, turn the hydraulic valve on, and up would come your trap. When it got up, turn it off, pull it in, back it up, set it on the rail. Beautiful. Hydroslave built small inshore pot haulers. When the guys started fishing in the deep water, what was that, Richie? Late 60s, I guess? They needed more hauler. So they turned to Marco. Marco was the company that built the crab trap haulers. If you've ever looked at the Deadliest Catch, you see those great big haulers that they haul with. Now the Marco hauler had a power takeoff in the front of the engine, had a hydraulic pump, a valve, had a big Gnomi gearbox that was bolted to a plate. There was a shaft came out through the plate with a flange on it, and the shivs were bolted to that. Very powerful, not real fast, very expensive. So this went along a little bit, and as more and more people were getting into the lobster industry, we needed something better. Bob Haynes, sitting right over here, designed a method to attach a set of shivs right to a hydraulic motor. If you look at this hauler, I don't know if you can see it or not, but you had the whole same thing. You had a hydraulic pump mounted on a power takeoff on the front of the engine. You could turn the pump on and off. You had a hydraulic valve that made the thing go, you know, backwards, forwards, whatever you want. You had a lot of power, but you had something you could afford. And this revolutionized the offshore lobster industry, this hauler. Everybody put them on their boats. They worked and worked and worked and worked. Absolutely fantastic. And Bob went on, Pine Hill Equipment. He was one of the guys that turned the New Bedford industry over with hydraulics and net reels and winches, and amazing what they built at Pine Hill Equipment. So this was real Westport's big contribution, one of them to the offshore lobster industry. The other thing that I don't know if you people know, we had a lobster trap factory in Westport, and it was at Fio's Garage. Well, Fio's Garage, you probably know now, was the Wing Carriage House. And there was a guy named Jim Delata and Bob Haynes. You couldn't get traps. One of the big things with everybody getting into this, you couldn't get traps. The 4-foot Anderson trap, everybody was just wanting them. So they decided they would build traps in Westport. So I used to go in there with Johnny Osborne Saturday mornings, and we'd start sawing stock. Well, they had a pile of oak boards there. I think they're like 1.25 inches thick. And the birds were sitting in the trees 2 days before, and they would be frozen, wet. I mean, they were tough to work with. So we'd spend most of the day cutting them in 4-foot lengths. And for the, we were cutting stock for the guys for the week. And the next day, we'd start up the gang saw. Well, this was like a giant table saw. It had an arbor on it, had a whole bunch of circular saw blades, and with spaces, you could decide how thick you wanted to saw things. And it was powered by a Chevrolet engine they took out of somebody's car. So we'd crank this up in the morning and start sawing. They say, well, we want so many laths. So we'd set the saw up to saw laths. And then we want stiffeners, we want runners, whatever it was, we set the saw up to do that. A couple of things I can remember, if you didn't keep pushing the board in, it would kick the board back out at you. And you had to clear the thing. But that poor old Chevy engine, it worked. Another thing that was a problem was the net heads for the lobster traps. In the old times, the guys that fished inshore, they may build 20 traps a year, they'd replace some that broken. They'd sit at home at night and knit heads. They had a frame, and they had some hooks on it, and they would take a knitting needle and knit the heads. Well, if we were building 100 traps in a week, that was 400 heads you needed. So there was no, doing that. And Bob and his wife, Ginny, figured out how to cut the heads out of twine, out of fishnet. And I remember going over there, and they had this fishnet spread all over the living room floor, and they were counting so many meshes this way and so many meshes that way, and cutting the heads out of fish twine. Then they'd cut over so many and so many, and cut a hole in it, and that was your head. So that kind of revolutionized that. The lobster trap factory left Fio's Garage, and it went to West Neck Road on the corner of Petty's Heights Lane, with a red metal building there. And with the advent of the wire trap, the lobster trap, the wooden lobster trap went away. They had to be dipped. Worms ate them, they didn't last, so the wire trap was another thing that really changed the business. But Bob was a tremendous contributor to the Westport and the lobster industry over the years.
A couple of quick things, Grant. One was a question for you, but the other thing too is that back in the 60s, Westport high school had a shop program that everybody had to go to, and also had a mechanic program. Well, thankfully I went into the shop program because I would have destroyed anything mechanical. I still would today. Harold Wood and Eddie Bebo had a lobster boat. And in the wintertime, that's what we used to do, right, Bobby? we made pots for them.
Free labor.
Yeah, free labor, And Joe Zala made sure that it was exact, So anyway, there was that. But Grant, I want to ask you a question before you layer on to what's going on here. You chose at some point to move to Fairhaven.
Yeah.
So maybe you could just talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, is this on?
Yeah.
I think so.
I think listening to these stories, a lot of this was before I started fishing here in Westport. So I'm going to talk about my experiences, which is basically from 1975 till I actually left Westport in 1983. 1975, I started fishing with Richie Earl, and the one thing that I noticed down in Westport at that point was there was a real boom in the offshore fishery. There were more boats all the time, like he talked about. We had new construction. You had Everett Mills and Curtis Duvall built the Quest. You had the Sideshow. You had the United States. You had the Sea King. You had Orin C. You had Rebecca and Naomi, and the Sheila and Linda. You had the Jenny and Jackie. You had the Sherry and Dale. And one of the big, there were some big players down there that I don't know if a lot of you know. There was a SHC syndicate, which was Alexander Smith, Bud Smith, Billy Hart, and Bill Chase. The Chase brothers had Billy, yeah, right, I got that. I'm good. The Chase brothers were involved with the Chabro, which was for Chase Brothers, of course, and then the Captain Don was built, which was Bill Chase. And Dick Allen was a captain down there. He had the Jenny and Jackie. Bud had the Sherry Andale. The Sideshow was there, and then in 1980 we built the Broadbill. And that's where I left Richie, and I fished 1 year on the Captain Don and then onto the Broadbill. But through this whole period of time, what was really, as I think back on it, was the fishery was really on a fast track. In other words, the boats were getting bigger, the fishing grounds were expanding exponentially. We no longer had to worry about the foreign fleet. Okay, our biggest concerns were interactions between mobile gear boats and fixed gear boats. So though all of a sudden, instead of worrying about getting towed up by the foreign fleet, you're worrying about getting towed up by the domestic fleet. Okay, which at that time was huge. The groundfish fishery in New Bedford was the biggest in the country, and it was booming at that time. Albert asked me why I left and went to Fairhaven, and basically it was because Westport Harbor couldn't accommodate the next boat that I built, which was a 77-foot boat. The harbor was just too dangerous and too shallow. This boat draws 12 feet when we're fully loaded, and I just couldn't do it. You know, the infrastructure wasn't here to support it. I still consider Westport my home port. It's still on the stern of my boat. I'd like to. I think what's going to be better is if I answer some questions, because I don't want to just talk about the history of lobstering in Westport. Is probably, I can talk about that period of time, but I think what everybody's here to hear about is the older part, you know?
Yeah. No, that's perfectly fine, because I think that most people have a ton of questions anyway, and like you, I'm always better at answering than I am.
Yeah, I think so. I remember my last experience sitting up here, I felt we didn't leave enough time for Q&A.
Okay, excellent. So maybe pass it over to Dave, and then we'll...
Good afternoon. So when Richie asked me to join this group, I said, what do you want me to speak about? He said, the regulations. About regulations? I said, you're going to have to bring pillows and blankets to accommodate everybody. I mean, it's the most boring subject. So I've kind of twisted that around. I'm going to talk a little bit about the management status, the status of the resource, and some of the issues that kind of confront the lobster fishery. In terms of my background, I have a very different background than everybody else on the stage. The closest I got to being a lobsterman when I started out when I was 16 and 17, I got a job working for Pete Manchester. Some of you no doubt know him. He was an old swamper that lived in Westport Harbor, and he had the reputation that he never threw anything away, he just threw it down in the hole of the boat. So literally, you could resurrect the history of swamp Yankees by going down below and looking at all the stuff he had stored down there. But he was a great guy to work for. Crusty, a bit crusty, but lots of fun. So I did that, and then I went on and went to college and graduate school. After graduate school, I basically ended up getting a job with Rhode Island Fish and Wildlife. And so, as I said, when Albert asked me that question, I had a little bit of a different path. I figured out a different path to get here. But so, in terms of management of lobsters, the states have been managing lobsters literally since the 1800s. The state of Massachusetts in, I think, 1860 adopted a minimum size that was 10 inches on lobsters. And ever since then, as a fisherman here can tell you, it's been a constant parade of regulations, and some of which have helped maintain the status of the resource, and others haven't. But in terms of the actual management process, the way lobsters are managed, the states kind of joined together and formed a group called the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission. It's basically a group of 3 individuals from every state. I'm one of the reps from Rhode Island. They get together 4 times a year and manage 40 species. A lot of the species you guys collectively fish for, or used to fish for, are managed by them. Striped bass, bluefish, lobster, Jonah crabs. You can go right down the list. There's quite a list. In 1976, to pressure from some of the people in this room, Congress passed a law called the Magnuson Act, and that basically interjected federal management into lobster management. And they formed councils. New England Council was in charge of lobster management. So the way that the management has kind of evolved has gone from all those states joining together, meeting 4 times a year, designing regulations to manage the fishery, to now a process that then subsequently involved the federal government, NOAA in particular. NOAA is responsible for, and I see John Bullard's out in the audience, former director of NOAA. NOAA is responsible for managing the federal waters fisheries. So in the case of the commission has a lead for the interstate fishery management regulations, and then basically they pass recommendations off to NOAA, and NOAA goes through a very complicated process and adopts the regulations for federal waters. So that's kind of the process that we've undergone. In terms of the actual regulations, I won't tell you what types of regulations because I bore you to death, but it's everything from minimum sizes to escape fence to the size of the traps are all regulated by either state or federal regulations. In my own view, I think the lobster fishery is a well-managed fishery, an example of a well-managed fishery, but that doesn't mean it couldn't be managed better. And so in terms of the actual status of the stock, there are 2 stocks of lobsters. There used to be 3, and then they combined. 2 of them is a Northern New England stock, which is the Gulf of Maine, and offshore Area 3 with Grant fishes, and then there's Southern New England stocks. In terms of the stock status, it's very different in those 2. The Southern New England stock that Richie spoke about early on was an extraordinarily healthy resource. right up until, I'd say, 1997. And at that point, there were events that I'm not sure anyone totally understands that took place. And basically that resource went from being incredibly lucrative to non-lucrative, which is what you've got today. And like an excellent example of that, in 1997, two states, the state of Connecticut and New York, landed about 14 million pounds of lobsters. The landings last year by those two states, 200,000 pounds. That's what's happened over that period. Now, what the scientific, there's no real scientific consensus on what happened with the stock, but they basically think that it's related to global warming. Lobsters have a very narrow temperature tolerance. It generally runs from 70 to 80 degrees. And once you get over the 80-degree mark, it's difficult for the larvae to survive. And then there are a lot of other influences. You've got ocean acidification. You've got a lot of other things, increasing predator populations and so forth that affected. But the long and short of it is the southern New England stock has basically collapsed. It's a collapsed stock, and it's still a viable fishery that takes place. The fishery that all of us fish on down here is about 1/4 the size of what it was historically. Once you get north of the Cape, it's a very different story. That stock, which is primarily fished by the fishermen in Maine, there are about 30,000 individuals who are involved in that. If any of you travel up on the coast of Maine, what you'll find is that there are lots of families. You'll have 3 generations of families out fishing together in the boats. It's really kind of exciting and inspiring to go up there and see all those different generations participating in the fishery. That stock is a very healthy stock at this point, but we've got lots of concerns. The scientific community has lots of concerns about that. The Gulf of Maine is the fastest of all the estuaries in the world, water bodies in the world. It's warming faster than 99% of the water bodies in the world. And that's due to a whole bunch of influences. A lot is not well understood, but it relates primarily to the cold Labrador current coming out of the Arctic down through Maine, and then you've got the Gulf Stream that kind of forces its way up into it. So as the Labrador current is basically slowed down, you've got more warm water. And the consequence of that is that their indices now are declining almost exactly the same way as Southern New England indices decline. And this is big business. There's no other way to describe it. You have that many people employed, but you basically have somewhere on the order of $750 million fishery in that area. This year, the index of abundance is down again for everything but the end of the year. And they're very concerned about where that's going. So we've proposed, the people that I work with have, up and down the coast have kind of proposed that they increase their minimum size, get more eggs in the water, try to buffer the communities. And the tricky part of all that is that in some of those coastal communities, and I'll use Westport. Westport used to be fairly dependent on farming and fishing, but that kind of evolved. They're still very dependent upon fishing out in that area. Some of those coastal communities, 95% of the income comes from fishing. So a drop in the lobster resources is a significant concern. I'm over my 10 minutes probably. But I know Richie gave me his 3. But I'm almost done. So I just want to conclude by saying the concerns that I think we're dealing with on lobster management. I don't think you're going to see big changes in southern New England unless we get a change in the environment down here. The resource is just kind of continue to kind of maintain itself. The individuals who are making money working in it are fishing further from shore, like Grant, and they're fishing primarily on migratory lobsters that are coming out of the Georges Bank in the Gulf of Maine. So I think that is kind of continued. The big fights now are trying to get the Maine folks to do something to save themselves, which is really tall order. One of the aspects that I most admire about commercial fishermen is they're fiercely independent. You can take the average commercial fisherman and put him on a leaky boat that's sinking, and he'll figure out a MacGyver trick to keep it going. But that makes them particularly difficult to deal with in terms of change. You know, that they're just not willing to quickly adopt something because somebody suggested it. Who are you? I remember going to my first lobster meeting where we suggested that Rhode Island raise the minimum size of lobsters, and I had a drunken fisherman in the back room stand up and said his mother caught more lobsters than we caught in our surveys. So the other challenges are, in addition to climate change, is ocean acidification. And then the last one on my list is that as the resource moves north, the whole lobster resource, there have been scientific studies by NOAA staff and Woods Hole that have pretty much documented that the lobster resource is moving about 10 to 12 miles a year, shifting north and east. And as a result of that, there are about 195 miles, I think, between Provincetown and Nova Scotia. So it doesn't take long before the center of the highest catch locations, the center of abundance, will be almost entirely in Canadian waters. At that point, we'll still be lobstering, particularly in the offshore areas, and there'll still be an inshore fishery, but it just won't be as viable. And so one of the big challenges is maintaining the economic viability of the fleet down here. The input costs of lobstering, as any of the lobstermen in the room will tell you, have gone through the roof. It costs a fortune to build a boat, repair a boat, buy equipment. It's difficult to find people to work on the boats. So input costs will continue to go up, and the imports from Canada will also go up. So it's like a double whammy. But thank you very much, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Wake up, Albert.
Huh?
Wake up, Albert.
Oh, no, I'm awake. I just, the lower half isn't. Well, that was great, but I think that really what is going to be the exciting part of this is the Q&A part, because these guys are better at answering questions. You guys have a lot of questions, so who wants to kick it off?
Claude.
Claude. Okay, I'm coming, Claude.
Thank you, Al. I just want to make attention to a very special part of what's happened in Westport over the years in the construction of outfitting fishing boats all the way up to the big draggers in Bedford. we got a family here. The old leader is sitting in that chair in front, Mr. Haynes, and three of his progeny, first generation and second generation, that have built a very new generation of winching equipment and other equipment for the fishing industry. And they have shipped stuff all over the world. We equipment that originates right here in Westport. And we got the leader sitting in that chair in front, looking at me, probably mad, and two sons and a grandson here. So I just wanted to call attention to something that Westport has contributed to the fishing industry with shipment of stuff all over the world and all over this country, and the development of winches and net drums unique to this outfit. I just wanted to call attention to it.
Now that's. Right. I'll get you in a second. Let me get David here, and then I'll run over there.
Okay, I just wanted to add one of the accolades to Richie Earle's quiver over here. Richie was the chair of the Westport Dredging Committee 20 years ago, I think it was, Richie, when the river was silting up and the fishing boats and the lobster boats were having to move over to New Bedford because they couldn't come into the Westport River. And we struggled. I was a newbie in town, a student, but I was let onto the dredging committee. Richie let me join, and we were having a hard time getting the Corps of Engineers to accept the fact that dredging the river would really provide a long-term benefit for Westport. And I'm not a lobster man, not a fisherman, but I do know how to work with government regulations. And I figured out, I got a copy of the Army Corps of Engineers handbook on how you do cost-benefit analysis. And I knew something about that. So I worked on that, and I think it helped us raise our benefits from well below the cost up to about 1.5 times the cost of doing the dredging. And so the Corps of Engineers accepted that and agreed to take on the job. And it was our understanding then, I think, that once they had done it, they took responsibility on into the future. And so they're now back out there again, doing the dredging of the harbor entrance, which is silted up again. But that's all kind of an outgrowth of Richie Earle's dredging committee of 20 years ago. So thank you, Richie, very much.
Yeah, it's a double-edged sword. It's good to see him out there again, but it's like a kaleidoscope. There's another side to it. They're dumping this stuff off the beach this time, out in 20, 30 feet of water. I think they're hoping some of it will come up on front of the campground in the east half of the state beach, because the stones need the sand. Otherwise, you end up like East Beach with a stone pile. But anyway, yeah, that was about 15 years ago, David. But the Army Corps is on the hook for it, so if you get global warming, you won't have to dredge again.
As far as the dredging goes, and I'm glad the Army Corps is finally taking responsibility for it, because the first dredging that I know of was back in the 1950s. And then it was in the 1960s when John Long got money when he was a state rep to dredge. And then again, it landed about 25 or 30 years. And you're right, Rich, it was 15 years ago, because I just bought the wharf at that point. And I remember you and I standing at the end of aisle 7 with the guy from the state, and they wanted to dredge the mud dock right up to the wall, and we had a confab and agreed that it would be 4 feet off of the wall because that's what was holding the wall together. And then we had another dredging. Now we've got another dredging. So, you know, good that we have the dredging, but it's been 5 times in the last, what, 70 years?
Yeah.
And it'll continue.
We hope.
Yes.
I'm Peter Johnson. I've been in town off and on for quite a few years, starting as a kid. Wanted to ask Grant a question. Paul Mooney told me the other day that your son has taken over the boat. Is that correct?
Yeah, I guess it's public now. Yes.
Would you just tell us a little bit about the boat trip, how many crewmen, how many days? What's it like out there?
So it's pretty interesting. When I first started in the fishing business, it was 100% owner-operators. In other words, I knew the guy that I was fishing next to. He had a stake in the game. He made the investment. And it's changed drastically. Right now, the offshore fishery is comprised of probably 97% corporate-owned. In other words, there are large companies that own multiple boats. I can think of actively productive offshore boats. There are 2 or 3 of us that are owner-operators. Just my personal choice on this was that I really believe strongly in, first of all, my family. My son has worked on the boat. I never allowed either one of my boys to step foot on my boat until they had an undergraduate degree. They would work and they learned how to mend traps and this and that, but they never ever went offshore until they graduated college. And then when they did go, they went just not full time. They went in between. My son John now, who is taking over the business. He graduated from Union College with 2 undergraduate degrees. He graduated from URI with a master's in Marine Affairs. He went down to South America and taught in Ecuador, in Quito, at the Ecuadorian Military Academy. So he got to experience a lot of different things. And then he came back to work and he was in between not knowing what to do and asked if he could come on the boat. I said, sure. And I made it as miserable for him as I possibly could. I honestly did, because I didn't want him to have to experience what I had, which was coming home from a trip and your kids look at you and go, Mom, Dad, Dad, right? Because you never see your family. The trips were anywhere at that point. They were, 8 to 10 days, 6 days, home for 3 nights, back out. And so it's demanding in that sense to keep a family, and I have to take my hat off to my wife. She's the backbone. Okay, so it's not. My choice was I wasn't selling it to corporate. I guess that's what you wanted to know. So to me, it's more important to keep it within my family. And we'll see what happens. I'm sure he's going to do great with it. So, is that?
Yeah,
Peter?
that's good. What's a good 5-day, 6-day trip? What's a good Paul?
He won't tell you.
I'll put it this way, okay? So it ranges.
Can we see your bank book? Yeah, right. Yeah, right.
It ranges. I can tell you this. Let me ask you a question. So I've done this now for 45 years, over that. If you were to ask me what was the best fishing I've ever seen, what would you think?
What was it?
1978.
Yeah, I mean, I go back and I remember when Bill Whipple was starting, I read the original Prelude reports. I know something about the P1 and the other boats that came in to get outfitted and so on. Those look like pretty good times, but maybe you've got the prices and
I'm not talking about value, I'm talking about poundage.
pounds. Well, I had read way back in the 60s, a local inshore fisherman was getting like 360 pounds a day.
Sure.
Bill Whipple was going out and getting 3,600 a day on the P1. And the question I have, you know, you're going out there and you're sitting 8-10 days and so on, and you're still in that same industry. I don't know whether it's the same place, and I know nothing about the conditions today. But, you know, what's the poundage? I mean, I'll tell you what Paul told me last week, but I don't want to repeat it.
So it varies, okay? So we've had trips where, let me answer my own question first. The best fishing that I've seen in over 45 years has been within the last 3 years. Okay, so whether that's climate conditions, okay, whether it's the stock, as David alluded to, the stock moving east and north. I fish as far east as you possibly can. I fish from me to that bench from Canada. Okay, so, but it's cyclical, I can tell you that, in all the years I've done it. And Bob Gifford, sitting right here, unloaded my boat for years, and he saw it. I mean, you have years that you're way up here, the next year you're down here, and you might stay down here for 2 or 3 years, and then all of a sudden you'll slowly climb, and that's the way the landings are. It's not, it's like, you know, you can't sit there and, I never plan on having, so you have a great year, right? Well, you can't plan on that for the next year. You can't run your business that way. You run your business in the worst case scenario all the time, okay? And if you do that, right, you're gonna make it. You'll make it through the bad times. You'll still be able to maintain your boat, because if you don't maintain your boat, you're not gonna be able to do this. And it's expensive. So, without you know, giving numbers, trips will vary from, I've hauled, we have so each permit is attached a trap tag, okay? So maximum traps is 1,984 traps for a federal permit. We fish 1,800, so hauling 1,800 traps now, I've come in with under 2,000 pounds. Okay, so that's what we call a broker. That's where the crew would have to pay the company money because they haven't met the cost of the trip. And then we've had trips where, you know, you fill the boat up and the boat's capacity is over 20,000. So you take the good with the bad. I guess that's kind of a roundabout way to answer it, right?
Thank you.
Yeah.
I believe the Wiley Foxes are ground in the mouth of the harbor with 45,000 pounds of lobsters on it.
I know you speak loudly, but here, use the mic.
I need the mic like a whole. I believe the Wiley Fox grounded herself in the mouth of our harbor with 45,000 in the late 70s. Is anybody agree with that?
That's correct.
That's correct.
Wow.
And Prelude Corporation had 4 large offshore boats.
Yep.
And they were constantly coming in with between 35 and 45,000 pounds per trip each.
Yep.
And some people may not be familiar with what Prelude actually was. It's the building which right next to the back eddy. That building was a lobster business. And they had a very large, it was the largest lobster business in the world. And it was, everyone that's in this room that was a lobsterman, through hard work, they started with a small boat and were able to do well and buy themselves a bigger boat, go further offshore, and some people had to borrow money from family to get the bigger boat and all that. Prelude was a publicly owned company, which was on the stock market, and John Hancock was the investor behind Prelude Corporation. So it was a multi-million-dollar business, employed between 150 and 300 people. And they were on the stock market. It was a publicly traded stock. And anybody could go to John Hancock and say, I want to buy 1,000 shares of Prelude Corporation. And so that's how they were able, Bill Whipple, that was his vision when he started Prelude Corporation he couldn't do it on his own, so he had to get a hold of the people at John Hancock. And they took interest in him, issued stocks, and that's how he was able to get the money to employ 400 people and have 4 100-foot offshore boats. And so it was more involved in banking than it was really with lobstering. But in the process, they would come in with 40 to 50,000 pounds once a week per boat. So just to give you a little background.
No, thanks.
What happened? Why is Charlie not today? What happened? Was it the Russians?
The Russians were a factor because the Russian boats were towing up the lobster gear. And there's a picture back there on the table of a newspaper article of the Pat San Marie where Joe Cardoza was the captain, and he steamed up in front of a Russian trawler and stopped. And they had to stop the boat or they would have rammed him. And so there was a lot of, there was so much involved with because the State Department got involved because John Hancock had a lot of clout. And at one point, the Prelude Corporation, through the State Department, seized a Russian freighter in California and put a lien on it, and the freighter couldn't do anything, and it was politics. It was the U.S. fighting Russia over this the freighter that the Prelude Corporation had seized. So it was, and there were. I was working there at the time, and there were more official cars in the parking lot with U.S. government plates on them that. Because and the TV reporters and everything, and that was the building which is now condos right next to the back eddy. But that was employed anywhere between 400 and 600 people at the time.
So what happened? Why is it not around?
Financing. They basically were spending more money than they were making. Kind of that catches up with you after a while.
When we had that lobster war going on with the Russians, Richie was quite famous for rattling Margaret Heckler, who was a rep.
I'm just going to tell that
And I
story.
remember one time he told her they were going to take the swordfish boats, the swordfish planes, and bomb the Russians with paint. And she said, please, Mr. Earl, don't do that, please. And there was a lot of the captains here. I know John, what was it, the Robert Ike, John, that you went alongside of, the Russian boat? And it was quite a thing. And the other thing that I was told, this might not be true, that one Japanese boat took 1 million pounds of lobster tails one winter in the area where we fished. So, and these boats were big. I mean, so that was, we had quite a war going there for a while.
On that Russian deal, I talked to Paul. Is Paul here? Brayton? No. He said Ted Kennedy actually called him from Boston and said, please don't bomb the Russians. We don't have airplanes, so it was going to be easy. I'd like to, one question I got to ask, is it true that John Osborne and Whipple were responsible for bringing trawls, lobster pot trawls to Westport?
Let John speak.
John, pass it down to John.
What was the question?
We wanted to know if you were one of the ones that started with lobster trawls in
You
Westport.
introduced us to trawls. We was, everybody in the harbor was fishing singles.
Yeah.
And you guys introduced trawls to us. It was a big deal. Right?
Yeah, I think it changed things, certainly.
Okay.
How about this?
Let me just add one thing to the landings that Bob was just referring to with the Prelude boats. All those landings, and this is what's really amazing, came from the Southern New England stock, which is right now, it's class So, and it hasn't collapsed from overfishing, it's collapsed from climate change. I mean, there was a time when the southern New England stock entails all of Long Island Sound and then the waters south of here, all the way down to, what's it, Virginia, I believe. If I were to ask anybody in this room where the majority of the landings from southern New England came from, what would your answer be? Would it be offshore, inshore?
Inshore.
It was. It was inshore. Long Island Sound was one of the most productive. If I'd known this when I first started fishing, I would have moved down there and fished there. But it's really amazing how quickly that whole resource has moved. So it was at one time very, very plentiful.
When we started with trawls, we would untie every trap, tie it back on again when we were fishing offshore, and then we figured out how to leave them all tied to this mile of rope and either set them over the stern or set them off the side. Well, Bill Whipple at that time developed the prelude clip. Jimmy Hudson must remember that. And it was a device that it came off the trap with a piece of wire and it clipped onto the rope. And when you got the trap in, you punched this pin and it unlocked this thing. But this was rather sizable, and I guess there were a couple of guys got headaches from it, but I was going to bring one today and I forgot, but that was another thing that, you know, that they developed and it didn't really work out. But you would have a mile of rope on the deck of the boat when you'd haul the trawl.
Yeah, I feel weird talking to you guys because I am totally a skeuk. I was lucky enough to spend summers here growing up on the East River and got a job. My first job was working for a woman by the name of Elizabeth Lees, who owned Lees Wharf. And I used to babysit on this guy when he was younger with his sister. And I didn't know at the time how lucky I was to be working down there, not only to learn about the Westport waterfront and get to know all the lobster guys, but also work for a woman who owned a business back at a time when, frankly, most women didn't even work. So it was a pretty cool to have that job. And, you know, the first question you guys had was, how did you get into the lobster business? And I can tell you, for me, it was really easy. I worked for her for a number of summers, and then one year, Philip Macumber came in and told me how much money he was making as a deckhand working for Prelude. And I said, well, Mrs. Lees, I won't be back next summer because I'm going to work for Prelude. And that might be one of the reasons why they went out of business, by the way. It was stupid money. We were getting paid a lot of money to work for Prelude, unlike where the crew has to take on some of the risk. We took no risk. We were paid a salary. That was very unusual for deckhands back in those days. And we shared the upside. If there was any big catch, we would get some of the profit. But anyway, it drives me crazy when I hear people talk about Prelude and their 4 boats and referring to them as P1, P2, P3, because that makes it sound like a big corporation. It really wasn't that big of a corporation. It was big for Westport, okay? But the P1 was the Pat San Marie, okay?
No.
No? Okay. I thought it was the P0. This is from the Pat San Marie. I'm going to leave this for the Historical Society. I worked on the deck. I was there when Joe Cardoza pulled in front of that boat and created that international incident. I was standing on the bow, watching the Coast Guard do nothing. Joe Cardoza, who was from Portugal, said to me one day when we were going by one of the Russian boats, and we called them Russian boats whether they were from Poland or wherever they were from. It didn't really matter. They were communists. They were the bad guys. We were the good guys. And he said to me, "You know what we do with them in my country?" So when we were being threatened, and again, you have to understand what a trawl is. A trawl is 1 to 2 miles of rope on the bottom, okay? It's not something you're pulling, it's stationary on the bottom. And when you have that on the bottom and a boat comes through towing something, it makes a damn big mess. And you could spend days trying to untangle it. we were trying to keep them out of our trawls. We were working one day and Joe noticed on the radar that one of these big 400-foot boats, we were 96 feet, Pat Sanbury, if I remember correctly. We noticed one of these boats going towards where we had a bunch of trawls. We dropped what we were doing, we sped over there, we went alongside of them. The Coast Guard is trying to fly flags to say, you know, turn around, stop! These guys, you know, they just kept towing. And Joe just took his boat with us on it, pulled right in front of this 400-foot Romanian trawler. And I can remember when she finally stopped, I was looking up at the bow of this trawler. Coast Guard wanted to arrest Joe, take him in because he had broken all sort of international rules. And I think this is where it paid off to have these friends in high places. They talked the Coast Guard out of doing it because shortly before that, there had been an incident in Boston that some of you might remember where a guy tried to defect from a communist boat and he had jumped on a Coast Guard cutter, I think, and they allowed his crew to come on, beat him up, and pull him back. And, you know, that was a horrible thing. So this time the Coast Guard checked with the higher-ups. They said, don't arrest Joe Cardoza. That's not going to play well in the newspaper. But there's no doubt in my mind that a deal was made. Within a month, Joe Cardoza was fired. I have a picture of Joe Cardoza being rowed from our boat, the Pat Sainte Marie, over to the Wiley Fox to go in. And that was the last time that he ever worked for Prelude Corporation. So it was a really exciting time to work down here. And Bill Whipple and Prelude really invented that whole offshore business, because back in those days, offshore pots were maybe 25 miles out, right? So you guys, the day fishermen would have their inshore pots and their offshore pots, but it was basically about 25 miles. Bill Whipple we were going out about 100 miles onto the continental shelf. So big time, and helped to really explode the lobster industry here in Westport. So.
We had an incident too with a ship that we cut off. It was a U.S. destroyer. And he was doing, spinning around in lobster gear. So Richie cut him off. We stopped him. And Richie went up and says, I don't know what the hell you're doing, but you're doing it in my lobster gear. And he says, well, we're doing man overboard drills. Oscar drills. So basically what he was doing was throwing a dummy overboard, and he was cheating on a high flyer. He knew where it was by a high flyer. And they'd steam off and they'd come whipping around. Well, they kind of apologized and left. There's a picture in one of the albums of all the guys on the crew of the destroyer looking at us.
You know, I don't understand why you jumped ship from my grandmother to Prelude. I really don't. Because anytime you wanted to, you could go in and get the half pint of coffee milk. Remember? that was her payday, Gulf Hill. So you went from that to Prelude, with a salary. I don't know. We may have to edit this video a little bit.
My name's John Bullard. I have a question for David Borden. I was the federal regulator that David mentioned in terms of management of lobster resource. And as he said, the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission would manage that resource, and we would have these big meetings down in Alexandria, Virginia. And in terms of all the species he talked about, the two big ones in terms of dollars are scallops and lobster. And it always kind of amused me that when we would talk about the problems that David raised during the meetings or after the meetings, I'd be sitting there with David and Grant, and with all of the states on the East Coast, be David and Grant and me, and we'd be thinking to ourselves, here are these three Westport guys talking about the future of the lobster industry. Could all be here and not in Virginia. But one of the things, as Grant mentioned and David, in the southern New England stock that caused the crash of that stock was temperature change. And if my memory is correct, and I retired 5 or 6 years ago, David mentioned that fishermen are fiercely independent, but they're also wicked smart and very resilient in terms of adapting to change. We've heard stories about that this afternoon. One of the strategies that we talked about was, if my memory is correct, how do we keep the lobster fishery going while in southern New England it's crashed because of high temperatures, while lobsters in southern New England are replaced by Jonah crab, which is a similar fishery, fished with similar gear. And my question, David, is has that come to pass in any way? Has Jonah crab replaced in any way the landings that did support the southern New England lobster fishery? Has it supplanted in any way the jobs, the income that people used to get from lobster?
That's great. Thanks, John. 3 years ago, I would have answered that question by saying yes, because the crab landings had gotten up to about, Jonah crab landings in southern New England, up to about 19 million pounds. But the last few years, the market for Jonah crabs has declined precipitously for a whole bunch of economic reasons. The value in Jonah crabs is in the claws, and the processing facilities, particularly in New Bedford, we're trying to pick all the body meat, and it's very labor intensive. Right now, the crab landings are about half what they were at their peak. The resource is very healthy. Grant can tell you, if you fish with the right bait, crabs like skates for bait. You fish with skates, in 2 days you can fill the pots full of crabs. There's just no market right now. So that's a big change.
I think we have time for one more, maybe two, Yeah.
So I have a question about Long Island Sound also, and I actually have a cottage in Waterford, Connecticut, right near the nuclear factory. Do you think that the warming of the water from the effluent from that nuclear factory had any effect on the lobsters there?
Only the hot water.
Well, if you're asking me, there's no question that water effluents from a nuclear plant is going to have an impact on a closed system like that. And I have no doubt that that has taken place. But the temperatures, I think, in Long Island Sound have gone up by 4 degrees in 25 years. And it's a spike in the temperature regime that really do the damage. So whereas 25 or 30 years ago, they may never have had 80-degree water for more than a week or two. Now they might have it for a month and a half or so. And that's what does the real damage. Larvae just can't tolerate it. And then the other thing that's happened in Long Island Sound is the predator populations, and I reference this. Black sea bass, when I was a kid growing up down in the harbor, I spent a lot of time with mask and snorkel on spearfishing for tautog, and you'd never see a sea bass. Now you could fall off the dock in Westport Harbor and probably count 50 directly below your boat. They're all little tiny sea bass, but that's a whole resource shift. That's a mid-Atlantic, Virginia, North Carolina, New Jersey resource that now is 200 miles north. And the common concern is that same type of action is going to take place on lobsters. We'll still catch lobsters, we'll still have a lobster fishery, but it goes back to John Bullard's point. The way these resources survive, the way the fishermen survive, is they consolidate. So you have fewer fishermen, and they just improve the economics by doing that. It's tough to say that. You want to keep everybody involved in these fisheries, but that may be the only way some of the fishermen survive. The boats down at the point, the Area 2 boats, like the Goose, they're fishing in a ecosystem basically where almost 50% or more of the fishermen have gone out of business. But they've lumped the fishing rights on fewer boats, so those fewer boats can still make money.
Now, we've also seen the direct impact that you were talking about with that 14 million pounds going down to a couple 100,000.
Yeah.
I used to be able to see in the 90s 130 lobster plants out around the breakwater near my house. There's now 3 that are all from one boat.
The Providence Journal had a story about a year and a half ago. The title was "The Last Lobsterman in Long Island Sound." And when I first started tagging lobsters, I went out with a guy named Mike Crenshaw, and he was the head of the Lobster Association in Connecticut. He was the last one that was a full-time lobster.
Could we just have one last story about a lobsterman who is not here? Captain John Borden?
What was that again?
Story about John Borden.
Oh, okay, so it's your story. Can't tell us.
John Borden, yeah, I get it.
Make it clean.
I'll keep this clean, we don't talk about each other much. John started, to my knowledge, with Bud Smith and Orrin Crapo, lobstering. John used to co-op over in Swansea.
Pirate.
You a pirate?
Pirate.
Everybody said he was a pirate. But anyway, John ended up with Orrin Crapo, who was a generational lobsterman from the point. And they worked for Bud Smith, who was building boats and getting offshore. I think it was the Sherry Ann Dale. And John worked a couple of years for him. And then John ended up building a boat called the RNC. And the reason he named it the RNC was, it was named after the guy he worked with, Orrin Crapo. And Orrin Crapo bought that boat that they were working on and renamed it the Atlantic Sword. And they went out in January of 76 or 77.
75.
75 was it?
75. I go out with the brand.
Okay. So anyway, Orrin was running that boat with Jack Pell and Sandy Pierce, and the boat showed up on the beach, pieces of it. Sandy came back into the West River in a lobster tank, but he frozen to death.
Yeah, my story about John Borden was, at one point I was working with some colleagues at the University of Rhode Island. And they have a program that's doing research interviewing fishermen. And I said, I got a perfect fisherman for you to talk to, John Gordon. And so I set up an appointment. So this young lady came over to interview him. And the first question John asked me said, what department does she work for? I said, Marine Affairs. Oh, this should be interesting.
John Borden. John was probably one of the most innovative and incredibly smart fishermen. He built all his own traps. In other words, at the time, I would say in the 70s and stuff, most of the guys were willing to try to go to wire gear. We were taking galvanized wire, building the frame of a trap, and then shipping them up towards Foxborough to a place called Marine Coatings Engineering, and they would dip them in this vinyl coating, so the trap would be now a vinyl coated trap. Very different type of coating than what you see in a typical lobster pot today. Those are all basically like it done with like a powder coat. This was like a liquid dip. And John said, you know, he goes, the areas that he fishes, he says, you know, I need something lighter, and he built welded up these steel frame traps, and then the rest of the whole trap was twine top, twine bottom, twine sides. Very, very, very maintenance heavy. But John didn't fish year round. John's season was basically 5 months, okay? He would take that Orange Sea, and he'd go to the 150 line, he'd set in, come back to Westport, get another load, go to the 150 line, set in, go back out, he'd haul it. He couldn't get through all the gear, he'd be headed over to Montauk to unload because the boat was full. And John did that for probably 3 or 4 years, I think, before anybody clued into that, man, there's some lobsters over around the 150 line, right? But he was always, you'd see him on the dock, he'd never, ever, ever let anything out. You get him by himself, pin him down, ask the questions, he would answer them. So I miss him dearly. One other thing.
Go ahead.
Just one other thing that I wanted to say. The face of the point, David, I'm sure you could speak to this, as far as the boats that are fishing down there now, they're not just lobster boats. In other words, to make their year, they do different fisheries. So they have different permits attached to the boats. In other words, to the days of saying, okay, well, I'm going to be an inshore lobster boat, and I'm going to fish from May or April until, get the gear home before Christmas. Those days are over. These guys now, they go out and they'll fish the inshore run, and then they'll go off and they'll go gill netting, and they'll do other fisheries. So it's changed. It's changed that way.
All righty. Well, thank you very, very much.
One thing that Jenny mentioned to me is any of you people who are here that went fishing, you did anything to do with our generation, she'd like to talk to you. She'd like to know about the Prelude Corporation from Bob. John Osborne has spent time talking with her, but Jimmy Hudson was here. Any of you guys that went fishing, Jennifer would really, really like to talk to you and get your stories of when you were fishing.
Good point, Russell. Well, look, everyone. Richie, you still got about 3 minutes on the clock. Anyway, thank you all very, very much for coming. I hope it was informative. I hope we didn't bore you to tears, which I doubt this crew would. So next year, you're going to be up here and talk about raising corn and growing corn and stuff. Anyway, the meeting is adjourned, and thanks again.